Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here, and this week I am very excited to welcome to the podcast Dan Joseph. So, Dan is an author of the book Backpack to Rucksack: Insight into Leadership and Resilience from Military Experts. So, Dan, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I was a combat engineer in the Army, wrote a little book on leadership based on things that I got wrong in life and some things that I got right. Was mentored by some awesome people, and I'm really excited to be here. Happy to talk about mental health. Happy to be here with you, and thank you so much for giving me a chance to be on your podcast and share my voice and that of the troops.
Yeah, I am really excited about this episode. So we are going to get into military suicide prevention is kind of what we're going to try to focus on, but we're going to talk about a lot of different things tonight, and we're going to try to fit as much as we can in. And veterans, I feel like in terms of taking care of them, I think that's something that as a whole, as a country, we need to do better. And even taking care of our active military service veterans. I mean, you guys provide this incredible service to our country, and there's a lot that goes into that. And not every veteran will see combat, but the ones that do, it's a lot. That's heavy. I mean, you guys see some really heavy stuff over there, and that can be a lot to deal with and a lot to process. And PTSD is a very, very real thing for combat veterans, or for any veteran, or anybody who serves in the military and serves in a war zone. It can be pretty heavy. So
speaking of war zone, by the way, I have to apologize. There's a lot of gunfire happening in the background right now. I'm actually on a Navy base, and they're shooting some guns off the boats right now. It's the SWIC guys training with the SEALs. So there's a lot of seagulls, a lot of background noise, and a lot of weapons being fired. So I really apologize for anybody who's annoyed by this, because I can hear it. Not sure if the noise cancellation is cutting it out.
I'm not hearing too much, so I'm pretty optimistic. But if it is good to know, if it does show up in the recording, that is what is going on. And so trigger warning for any veterans that are listening who are dealing with PTSD. So let's jump into with why you decided to write this book.
So essentially, the reason I wrote it, I had a soldier in my platoon. My last week as platoon leader, he survived his suicide attempt, and his name's Cody. He's alive today. We're still in touch. He wrote the introduction to the book as a survivor of suicide. When I got out of the Army, I was trying to process what exactly went down and just the weight of the situation. And, I spoke to his mother on the phone the day I found out about it, and let her, I promised her that we're going to get him help. And we did, but it really changed my life, because he's somebody that I enjoyed being around. I mean, I loved all the soldiers that were in my platoon, and Cody we had a lot of great talks together about mental health, about just the struggle, because it was real, and the struggle was real, and we were sincere about it. And I just felt this I was just so compelled to have him speak into people's lives through this book. And so I know that a lot of these soldiers won't share their stories. They don't want to. They don't want the spotlight. They don't want to relive past trauma. They don't want to mull over the past too much, but they are willing to have their story shared. And so I'm sort of a facilitator of that. My other friend, he's a good buddy of mine who served in the Marine Corps as an enlisted Marine and then became an Army officer. He wrote the foreword to the book, and Austin's story is as compelling as Cody's. He lost 13 men from his unit to suicide after Afghanistan.
Wow.
And at the time I wrote my book, I mean, it's just unreal saying that. Like, those words, it's just unreal. 13, so hard to process that. But 12 had killed themselves, before I wrote my book. They took their own lives. We talked about it. I asked him how he was doing to check in on him, because he came close. He told me, he's like, look, I guess these guys had their reasons. I don't know. I mean, we all have struggles. I can't judge them. We don't know what they were going through, but it just sucks that they're gone now. Right. And I thought, but the story can't end there. We have to see there has to be something else we can do for those others who are still alive and that we could lose, you know. And then after the book came out, he told me that the 13th service member killed himself. So it's real, it's ongoing, it's worth the discussion. It's something heavy and messy, but if we don't talk about, I mean, that's what leadership is about, right? We get
Yeah.
into it. We get into the stuff that doesn't have a black and white answer. It gets complex, and that's where leadership exists. If there's not tension in the room, then we're not doing something scary enough, dangerous enough, big enough, right?
Hmm.
And this is a big enough obstacle that we have to be willing to work on overcoming it. And only together, we're only going to do it together. We can't do it isolated.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that is one of the main goals. So for anybody who has been a longtime listener of this podcast knows that our main goal is breaking the stigma that is mental health. And we're making strides. We're definitely taking those steps as a country and just as society as a whole, that it's more okay not to be okay, but we've still got a long way to go. And, suicide is one of those things that we have to just shine a big, huge spotlight on it. I mean, because suicide is one of those things that people get there because they feel so hopeless and they feel in such a dark place. And if you shine light on that darkness, you can give them a way out. You can help them find a way out of the darkness. So one of the things that I want to ask is, with Cody, were there any signs? Did you notice any changes? Did you have any idea of what he was going through?
Yeah, definitely. And again, I apologize. Here comes a Navy helo coming overhead right now. Yeah, Cody. So the thing about soldiers is you got to be careful when they get quiet. Soldiers are,
Okay.
we're supposed to complain. We're supposed to be loud. We're supposed to, vent to one another. But when a soldier gets quiet, that's when you have to really put your ear to the ground to think about, listen to those subtle cues, right? The nonverbals, the kind of temperament in the room, and it's a sign of people losing hope. And so there were some discussions in which it was less. I noticed that there's more of a sense of, hey, this is just the way it is, or things aren't really going to change, or there's just so much going on with the lockdowns and with other things. There's a lot of variables to it, right? I mean, people were hurting around the world during the lockdowns, and it was a global issue, but which also caused us all to minimize our own stories of struggle. And I think that's kind of what happened with Cody. And he struggled in the past. There were issues in the past, and I don't want to share too much about his life other than what he was willing to share in the book. But he does share this, that there were struggles and he wrestled with stigma. But prior to that attempt, it's a sense of hopelessness that occurs, and it's at a neurophysiological level. And I talk about it, not to completely sterilize this and make it sound clinical, but what happens in the brain, what I believe and know what happened to Cody, is that there's, after a certain amount of time being in a temperament, right, it becomes more pervasive, and then the brain just goes into this sequence where it shuts down certain aspects of itself that help us feel time. And so if you can imagine for a moment what it feels like to be in a timeless situation, it feels indefinite. And so Cody felt stuck in this situation where it's not going to get better. It's just the way it is. It's always going to be like this. It's always been like this. Therefore, there's no hope. And so what's so important is to allow through grounding techniques. And I mean, we can talk about this forever, but through grief as well, you get people back into their bodies and they're able to access some past trauma. And then what happens in these functional MRIs is that they see these areas of the brain that do help us feel time. They start to turn back on again. So
Okay.
functional
Yeah.
MRIs will show the blood flow in the anterior cingulate. There's 4 or 5 different spots. The anterior cingulate is definitely one of them. I don't know if it's the hippocampus. There's 4 or 5, and I put them on a blog that I just posted on my website. I called it "When Suicide Makes Sense." And the reason I named it that is because in the brain logically thinks, this is my way out. I just want the pain to stop. I just want the
Yeah.
situation to change, and it won't. And I felt that in Cody, his eye contact, his demeanor, the way he spoke, right? It started changing, and I knew something was up. I wish I followed my gut sooner. And right. And I kind of lagged on that a little bit, and it led to a situation where I'm lucky he's alive. I did talk to him about his mental health quite a bit. He did let me know that he was okay, but that was something he said that he didn't really feel. And it wasn't his fault. It's complex. Mental health is complex. And it also, there's a point where I didn't want to pry. So if
Right.
he did want to tell me an answer, I don't want to then make him feel as if I'm coming after him. I didn't want to make him feel targeted or that I was pitying him or making him feel inept. So I wanted to respect him as an adult, right? But at the same time, the question is, how much do you lean into somebody? And what if that is a boundary for them? Do you
Yeah.
invade past that boundary or do you respect it? I mean, this is, again, this goes to the complexity of how do you help someone with their mental health struggle if they're not willing to open up and share?
Yeah, and I think there are limitations, especially in your situation where you're a platoon leader, right? And so, Mark and I talk about suicide prevention, and one of the things that we say is you just flat out ask somebody, "Do you want to die?" But, it's different if you're a psychologist or a friend versus someone in a position of power, like a platoon leader. Like if you're a CO, I mean, the dynamic is just it's different. And so, I can see where that can be a really hard line because if you say to somebody, "Hey, are you okay? I noticed these changes," and they tell you one thing, you have to take their word. I mean, where is that line? Where is that boundary? What boundary do you cross? Now, we know that there is the stigma still around suicide and around, mental health and particularly mental health illnesses. Do you feel like the stigma is worse for soldiers?
As opposed to other branches or as opposed to just society in general?
As opposed to society in general. And so do you feel like
Mhm.
the stigma is harder to break for soldiers? Is it harder for a soldier to say mentally, I am struggling than it would be, say, for a civilian to say, I am struggling mentally?
The quick answer would be yes, but at the same time, I'd want to take in consideration all the different, just the subcultures and all the
Hmm.
different variations of what exists throughout our nation. Because there's so many. I mean, because we can even break this down into is it perhaps even more so in the masculine culture in a masculine culture. So if
Mm-hmm.
there's a female soldier, is the female soldier more willing to disclose? And I worked with a female soldier who she did disclose it, but yet we had a male soldier who did nearly after that. So I'm trying to think right now compared to my friends in society as well. I think that especially the older generation of soldiers, yes.
Okay.
To your question, the answer is yes, because they lack the vocabulary, not because of anything they did wrong, but it
Hmm.
was just generationally back then they weren't as prone to be discussing these matters, right, as explicitly as we do now. They didn't have all the terminology and all the words. Yeah, they knew what like PTS was and whatnot, but I served with many combat veterans who were there for the first and second wave in Iraq and fought in Afghanistan early on and saw some devastating stuff as young 18, 20-year olds. And now they're in the military leading as NCOs and whatnot. And they told me that back then, if you were broken, you just carried on. You
Hmm.
just Charlie Mike, you just move forward. Nobody cares if your knee's busted up, if your ribs broken, if you're depressed, alcoholic, what nobody cares. You just keep moving, keep gunning forward. So now with these newer soldiers coming in, I feel as if the stigma it's a lot less with these
Okay.
younger soldiers coming in. It definitely we're making huge improvement. I'd like to see more of an improvement on the senior side of these veterans,
Hmm.
right? These ones who've been in for a while because they're like with Austin, these 13 individuals who took their lives. I mean, how that's such a tragedy. And so
Hmm.
why didn't they have the language to discuss that before they did it? There's so many questions, and I don't want to torment people with feeling guilt on not quote like saving someone's life because you can't
Oh,
save
sure.
somebody. You have to just kind of guide them, and they have to ultimately make that decision, right? To
Yes.
But my question is, how much information is lacking about neurobiology, neurophysiology, about how the brain works? Because especially in the military, if we can break the barrier by not talking about feeling states.
Hmm.
I think if we talk about, you look at our weapon systems, right? Or our vehicles, we talk about maintenance. We can break it apart and put it back together with our eyes closed, kind of a thing, right?
Yeah,
Why can't we do that with the mind? Because the mind should be our most powerful weapon. And it's not
it
just a
is.
lethal weapon. It's supposed to be a weapon of, de-escalation, a weapon
Hmm.
of it's not supposed to be just to bludgeon people with warfare, right? We need to be creative and come up with solutions that help prevent the loss of life. I mean, these lives are precious, right? We're not just going to make decisions as leaders to throw somebody in a meat grinder and just tell them to go fight because I said so. I mean,
Hmm.
they're brothers and sisters and husbands and wives. I mean, that's how I saw my troops, right?
Yeah.
And I believe the stigma is breaking, and I think there's so much more work to be done. So I'm
Yeah.
just going to write books because I don't know what else to do.
So I think that, there's this air of soldiers because soldiers, they're supposed to be tough, right?
Mm.
I mean, they go through boot camp or they go through this basic training and they're put through a lot of physical pain, and it's kind of in the military, it's this idea of we got to break you down and then build you back up as a unit. And so
Mhm.
soldiers, like they're supposed to be tough. And I think it's hard, as a society for us to think of soldiers as having any sort of weakness because they're supposed to be our first line of defense. But we have to remember they're still human and they still have to deal with and process their emotions. I mean, I cannot imagine what it is like to have to take somebody else's life or to be involved in a situation where somebody else's life ends, no matter what the circumstances are. You don't just walk away from that the same person you were before it happens.
I have a friend. I want to talk about that. You just touched something that tugged on my heart. What you just said, because I had a counterpart in the military who accused me of being soft and weak and just pathetic of a leader because I didn't believe that taking a life is just that it's easy to do. And he had said, no, it absolutely is easy to. That's why we joined the military. And I said, that's not the case, because there's a
No.
psychological impact when you do that, and it's going to take a toll. Now you'll do it because you're trained to do it, but you need to respect the fact that there is a weight to that, right?
Yeah.
And he just was like, no, you have no idea what you're talking about. I was just at the pool the other day. There's this guy that he's awesome. He was overseas and operated with the SEALs, part of their community. He's an adjacent community to the SEAL teams, but he was there with them, and he told me about the impact of taking lives in war and how now, a decade after that, he's still feeling the weight of that, and he's just now making peace with it, or finding ways to make peace with it. But he had talked about how there was this sort of unexpected weight from those decisions, even though they were justified killings and it was to protect service members and it was in war, right? And I told him, I said, hey, I just got to say thank you for sharing that with me, man, because you just answered a question that was on my heart about it can't be easy. People
No.
can't go around and romanticize this, because that's a part of you that you
Hmm.
gave to our country by taking someone's life, because now you're carrying that on your conscience and I'm not. And I just to be able to honor that weight that they're carrying is so important, and it was just so cool that you brought that up. I really appreciate that, because I just came across this, 24 hours ago, and it's so cool sharing it with you, because this is real stuff. This is real
Yeah.
stuff that I think we should talk more about.
It's something that we have to talk more about. I mean, the military is so complex and there's so much that goes into it. But, that's the nitty gritty part that I think people don't like to talk about. And I think
Mhm.
anybody who dreams of the glories of war and of battle, I think they need to, to think long and hard before joining the military, because it's not glorious to take somebody's life and to have to carry that weight around. And so, I think it's one of those things that you need to know that going into it, that is a possibility.
Again, you're pulling on my heart. So you know what happened with Afghanistan with the pullout, when those, Marines
Hmm.
and soldiers, and that devastating loss of life, right?
Hmm.
So my soldiers were all in the field training when that happened. And then all of a sudden, my guys were like, hey, did you hear? Did you hear what happened? Did you hear what happened today? I'm like, holy smokes. Like, what are these guys all getting, excited about? And they're like, dude, we're going to war. Like, it's going to kick off again. This is about, did you see what happened? They just killed our guys. And, my heart sank, because these guys were like, let's go to war. Let's go fight for our country. Let's go do this, which is honorable, right? They want to fight for their brothers and sisters who were killed. And, but they asked me, like, hey, sir, like, you want to lead us? You want to lead us in war? You want to go into war? And I'm like, look, guys, you got to understand something. Your lives aren't something to gamble with. This isn't
Yeah.
something where a leader should say, heck yeah, let's just march in there. I mean, there's a point where, like, if you're giving a brief and you're in front of your unit, yeah, you want to have that solidarity, right? That confidence, because they want to see that in you, that you're a confident leader. But there's a difference between being confident and then saying, I'm just willing to do whatever to look a certain way or look tougher. It's like, dude, any decision I made, and I told them this, you realize if we go to war, I was your platoon leader, every decision I make, I have to calculate the probability in my heart, in my mind, in my conscience of whether or not you're going to make it back. And, in my line of work as a combat engineer, they taught us that there's a very high percentage of loss that's acceptable on breaching missions and whatnot. So you could lose a majority of everybody that standing around you and still be considered mission successful. That's not something to just walk away from without giving it a ton of thought. Because
Yeah.
in my mind, just like with Cody's mother, right, I have to answer to their parents. That's how I perceive it. These parents are lending us their children. I know
Hmm.
that service members sign their contracts, but at the end of the day, every service member has a family supporting them.
Yeah.
Whether it's your real family or an adopted family, or just there's somebody out there who loves you and wants you to come back. And it's so important to realize that their lives are extremely valuable. And sometimes they don't even consider that. They will go into danger without thinking about I could die, this could hurt me. And that drove me crazy because I wanted to like bulldogishly protect them like I was their dad or something.
Which makes sense. And so, again, I think it's important to talk about this because it's one of those things. This is a side of the military that we don't get to see. As a civilian, we don't get to see and understand what goes on in the military in terms of, your decisions that you make as a platoon leader, as a CO, it has consequences. And, that's a heavy burden to carry, knowing that the decisions that you make, if you do it wrong, it could cost somebody their lives, and maybe it didn't have to. And that can be a lot to wrestle with if you lose somebody in combat. So I want to change gears real quick. So is there a such thing as being medically discharged from the military for mental health reasons? Is that something that happens? I mean, I know if somebody starts showing early signs of like severe PTSD, like where they're flashing back or if they can't function, but is it acceptable for someone just to say, I can't handle this anymore mentally? I need a medical discharge. Is that a thing? Or where's that line? To an extent, soldiers do have to be tough. They have to be hard in certain situations and to an extent. So where is that line of this is too much for me?
Yeah, I want to say that that's a pretty nuanced discussion that they would have with the medical care provider, that there would be a
Okay.
backstory on where did you deploy? What was the medical intervention since then? What are other surrounding variables? I think they would look into it. And then when it comes to discharge, like whether it's, I'm sure it'd be an honorable discharge. And then when it comes to the coverage from the VA and all of that, I'm not entirely sure how the whole process works out. But obviously, if it was documented that they were in certain battles and certain situations, then that would play into it for sure. But there's definitely a big discussion to have with the care providers, and I think that's
Mm-hmm.
something that's constantly evolving because there's so much more information, because they have behavioral health, and behavioral health does a great job when
Okay.
of listening to soldiers and keeping catalog of everything that's happened in their life that they're willing to disclose. And so there's a lot of rumors that go around, such as if you go to behavioral health, everyone's going to find out about it, and then you can't carry a weapon, you can't drive a vehicle, you can't do your mission. It really depends on what you're suffering from, and then
Mm-hmm.
that'll dictate whether or not you're able to have a weapon. So, but for the most part, they don't just go around sharing that. You'd have to actually go disclose it to your chain of command, unless there is an
Okay.
issue of self-harm or harming someone else. So
Mm-hmm.
this all kind of plays into it. I think it's pretty convoluted because there's so many questions going on about how much. Well, yeah, I guess since I'm not the subject matter expert on the clinical side, I probably shouldn't say too
Right.
much because I don't want to give false information.
Mm-hmm.
But I can say that there are many service members I served alongside who were combat veterans who would go through flashbacks, go through dissociation in the middle of sometimes a training exercise. Not, I don't want to make them sound bad. I'm obviously not going to say names, but there were a few
Sure.
where, say, if we detonated an explosive, right, a charge on a range, and they would glaze over and just be completely at a loss for words. And you're in the middle of a conversation with them, and then you ask, "What's going on?" I asked the guy, "Are you okay? What's going on?" And he said, "That detonation just reminded me of losing my buddy in our convoy movement back in Afghanistan." And so I was like, "Dude, I'm going to give you a second to just breathe, collect yourself." He wasn't emotional. He just was completely frozen. I mean, it was a freeze
Yeah.
response. And
Mm-hmm.
so he's not about to disclose that because he doesn't want to lose his job. He doesn't want to be
Mm.
taken out of uniform. So yeah, so and it didn't happen all the time. They're
Right.
not walking around just completely broken all the time. And I don't want them to think that I'm saying that. But there were moments where it was extremely important for me as a leader to be sensitive to that and to give
Mm-hmm.
them the space and to not bring shame into it, not make it awkward, just be respectful, be quiet about it. And then also let them know if there's ever an issue, don't think it's weird to bring it up. I have your
Okay.
back if you need, and not every leader may see it that way, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
most of them do. I don't know. It's, again, this isn't something we talk about, and I wish we did. I wish they gave us a brief on, if you are a new officer, this is what you need to know before you lead combat veterans. Because I had a
Yeah.
soldier in my platoon with a Purple Heart, and I asked him for his opinion because it was valuable to me, and I could tell all the other soldiers respected him because of what he went through in war. But I also didn't know how to navigate that. I didn't know how often could I talk to him about it? Was I allowed to explicitly ask what happened in war? I mean, should we give him a platform to tell his story to all the troops and honor that,
Mm-hmm.
and who else has stories in our ranks that there are amazing service members that I talk to that experience some crazy stuff, crazy firefights, just amazing situations where they're still alive and breathing and they shouldn't be. And it's just such a gift to us, right? And
Hmm.
I'm wondering, why aren't you in front of everybody briefing us? Why aren't you telling us about what that taught you and the lessons you learned? Because that to me is way more valuable than just pulling up a document and reading it. And
Yeah.
so I wish we could hear from them and then get a better grasp of the all the intricacies of mental health,
Yeah.
and what that looks like in action.
Yeah, and I agree. I would love for soldiers who want to have a platform or who want to, because, I mean, I think there are certainly people who would prefer to be quiet about their mental struggles. And, I think we obviously need to be respectful about that. But if somebody wants a platform and they want to speak up about their struggles, I think we should give it to them. So I have another question for you. Are combat personnel, are they required, or if they are involved in an incident where life is lost, are they required to go through any sort of counseling or therapy session because of that?
Oof, that's a good question. So because I haven't been to combat, I was in a non-deployable unit. I don't really
Hmm.
know. What I know from what my buddies told me. Okay, this is they have to disclose, the friends I had, many of them had to disclose the situation in which the enemy was killed to like a
Right.
JAG officer, right? To make sure it was legal, to make sure the rules of engagement were followed. Others, and this is where moral injury comes to play. I've been told stories of things that they would never tell anyone. They would never tell a psychologist. They wouldn't want to disclose it. And this is going back to what you said earlier about giving them a platform. This is why they don't want a platform. They don't want to relive it, and they don't want
Mm-hmm.
to admit stuff that may have happened, that they've witnessed, that they did. They're not sure what it means. There's so much in the heat of war that happens, right? And this is where isolation occurs. So the weird part about me, this is where people are like, why do you write a book, and what's your resume in the military that you've done such a great job. And this is the cool part about being who I am. These combat vets opened up to me about stuff that they never told another human being. And it was
Okay.
because I led with vulnerability about my own issues before I joined the military, about anxiety, panic, fear, stuff that happened in childhood, trauma that I was working through in jujitsu. And many of them told me that I was describing physiological aspects of their lives, of their bodies that they felt since war, right? But they've
Mm-hmm.
never had the words to express it. And so with that came this awareness of, hey, can I ask you something else? Like, what does this mean? What does it mean when I react like this? What does this burst of anger mean, or this rage, or my resentment for this or that? And then we talk about it and we tease it out. And basically it's like, you tug on that thread and you dig and dig, and then you see how it associates with so many different aspects of their lives, including warfare, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when they just were telling me, you have permission to share my story, just leave my name out of it, but also I don't ever want to tell it. I don't want to be known for
Mm-hmm.
it. I don't want people to ask me about it. I don't want to relive it. I'll tell you. If you think it could help someone, go ahead and tell them. But as for me, like I'm still processing it. And it's such an honor for me to be gifted that, but it also is scary because I need to respect that, right? It was their
Yeah.
life that was on the line. It wasn't my life. And so I
Mm-hmm.
don't ever want to say things in a crass way where they feel as if I'm taking their stories and monetizing them or trying to look a certain way, because it's not about my image, right? I'm not the
Mm-hmm.
combat vet, and I'm not trying to make myself more relevant than I am. The only thing I want to do is give them language so that way they're not trapped in their own minds, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Which is fantastic. And it's so great that you have given people at least a platform or at least an outlet to talk about it. Because one of the biggest issues I think with mental health is when you try to keep it inside, eventually it's going to find a way out, and usually in an uncontrolled way. And so, what you've done is you've given them this controlled way to get it out, right? To get the bad out. And I think that's something that, soldiers need. And so, what are your thoughts on mandated therapy or mandated counseling for veterans who see combat? What are your thoughts on that?
It could be a dangerous thing, and this is why. It's if we did it, if we I wouldn't say, because we sort of do have this thing where they have to come back and check a box that says, how are you doing after deployment? But
Okay.
it's just, are you good? Yeah, I'm good. Okay, you're good to go. At least that's how it was back 10, 15 years ago when some of my friends deployed. But here's the thing, when my buddy, he told me some stuff that he's never shared to his wife, he's never shared to a behavioral health specialist, to nobody, about what happened
Hmm.
in war. We're still in touch today, but I made it a point to call him every day after that. And we were stationed at the same base. So I'd see him. And I was just checking in, like, how are you doing? Because I've had hangovers from sharing stuff in therapy before.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, he said, I've been having vivid nightmares every single night for the past 3 nights. And I felt like I had the flu. I just felt exhausted. And I said, that's normal when you disclose a trauma that you've buried for years, because like you said, it comes out in uncontrolled ways. He said he was reliving a lot of those scenes and hearing a lot of stuff, right? The guys he lost and whatnot. And so what's important, what I learned through therapy is that it's so important to throttle the amount of information that people are disclosing for their own sake, because self-disclosure is such a power, it has such a powerful like recoil. It's like firing a
Mm-hmm.
weapon. If you fire a 9mm versus 223, 5.57, a 50 cal round, like each one, the bigger round, the bigger the recoil that you're going to feel. And so I felt bad about my buddy, because imagine if he got to a point where he fell into a deep spiral because of that. He could have, right? But he didn't. But he could have if he disclosed something that he's never told a human being before. And so it was a reminder to me. And actually, this happened with another buddy of mine who, again, he's like, I want to tell you some stuff that happened this time in childhood. It was after having multiple divorces and whatnot. And we were talking about, what happened in childhood that could have done this. I mean, he wanted to go down that route. And then next thing you know, he was kind of stuck in this space of, it was really, really heavy, a lot heavier than he thought. One comment that he made really kind of impacted me. He said, I didn't realize how much time just passed. Like, meaning just in this discussion he and I were having, like hours passed. He's like, dude, that felt like a few seconds. And it was because he was stuck in the past, that, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I caution them. Of course, I want them to share. Of course, I want them to get stuff out, but they need to be able to grieve it, and they can only grieve it in smaller pieces potentially. Anyway, and this is something I really want to do some more research on, to see, can we quantify it? Can we find ways to figure out how much people can handle? But every person's different. And it depends on the trauma, the size of the trauma, and the frequency of it, I think, is kind of the two ways that psychologists talk about it.
Okay, which is good information. All right. So, Dan, this has been a fantastic conversation. And thank you again for joining us. Again, that book is Backpack to Rucksack: Insight into Leadership and Resilience from Military Experts, Dan Joseph. If you are interested in picking up a copy of that book, I will have the title and Dan's name in our show notes so that you can easily find that. So next week, Mark and I are going to be out. So we're both traveling. So we will be back the following week with sleep disorders. Again, Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. This is awesome. Appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you. And thank you for your service to our country.
You got it. You're worth it.
All right. We will see you all next week, everyone. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.